Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Setter Tales Podcast. I'm Wade Kisner. Thomas is off tonight. We hope you had a great holiday season, Christmas. Looking forward to next year and the new year here to come in a few days. We just wanted to update you on a few things that we have going on. Obviously, we've been doing some guiding ourselves. We had a 2-day blizzard here in Iowa that kind of shut things down for a while, but I think most of the country felt the same effect of that cold blast, and so thankfully that's moved out of the area, and we hope we can get back to some better temps where we can get the dogs back out in the field and finish up the season strong. This episode, of course, is brought to you by the good folks at Kinetic Performance Dog Food. And we built it for our dogs, and you'll love it for yours. And that's a motto that they have carried from the very beginning, and it's a true one. So check that out if you haven't heard about their food. It's a great product that we've been using for many, many years. Tonight we want to bring back one of our featured guests that we've had on several times, Ian Donovan. And Ian comes from the military background and has spent a lot of years training some of the country's elite military dogs. And, now he's done a good job, or he's in the process of transitioning from that into taking that same skills and those training things that he's done into the hunting dog world. And we have been a recipient of some of his knowledge, and we put it to use in some training some of our setters. But we want to bring him back on tonight, and we'll see if we have Ian there. There he is. Welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me, man.
We've in the past have talked about several different phases of training, and tonight we kind of want to talk about one that people hear about, but maybe they don't quite totally understand it. But that is we'll call it the trained retrieve. Other people have heard it called force fetch or force break. There's some other terms that people have referred to it as, but there's different techniques and how that whole process is accomplished. There, basically, what it means or what it's all about is getting a dog that will reliably retrieve, and that is that kind of correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a dog, for me, a dog that's finished as a trained retriever can't really get there unless he fully understands what's expected of him in the retrieving realm. And force fetch or the trained retrieve is really just a way that you can clearly articulate to that dog what's expected of him when it comes to retrieving. A lot of people just kind of rely on a dog's superior genetics, Labradors or even bird dogs that are more inclined to retrieve than other dogs just because they're genetically predisposed to do so. But if you really want a dog that's a proven retriever, teaching him how to retrieve and teaching him exactly what's expected of him throughout that retrieving process is an absolute must. And that's why we've really started training I personally have started training each one of my pointers to retrieve, even Labradors that I've had to retrieve. And yeah, it's called force fetch. It's called the trained retrieve force. To me, it's just another way that we communicate with the dog exactly what we expect out of them. And when you can do that successfully, you get the best results. So yeah, it's all about teaching the dog that he controls whether or not he feels pressure. Just like you would with an e-collar and any other obedience type of situation. So we're just training him to be obedient one more time. And now this new obedience act is the act of retrieving.
So is there a particular age that a window of time in that dog's development that you're trying to hit when you want to do that process? I'm sure there's some obedience things that happen before that, but at what point do you like to introduce the trained retrieve?
Yeah, so I like to introduce it as soon as the dog's done teething, right? So we don't want a lot of stuff going on in that dog's mouth, a lot of discomfort, pain. That's going to happen the entire time that he's growing new teeth and losing those new teeth and chewing on things and teething. So once teething is is finished and the dog's got all of his adult teeth in, is when I like to start the trained retriever, start teaching him how exactly to retrieve and what I expect out of him when he is retrieving. Normally that
Okay.
happens for most dogs around 5.5, 6 months, right? When you know for sure that he's not going to be teething anymore, no more baby teeth in his mouth. And brain development happens at that point too. That's when we start teaching dogs obedience for the most part as well. They're kind of away from the mother. They're coming into their own as a growing adult dog, right? So they can be a little more confident in themselves and become their own dog. So about 5.5, 6 months old, but for sure not before he has his adult teeth and he's done teething.
Yeah. And obviously one of the challenges to that is the sessions themselves. And do you keep those relatively short at the beginning, or
Oh
do
yeah.
you try to get the dog's confidence? I'm sure, because I mean most scenarios that people probably hear about or have read about are the dog's on a bench, on a table, off the ground. But the
Mhm.
reason for that is so the dog can focus only on you, right?
Right, right.
Okay.
So yeah, we'll jump into it, man, and we'll talk about exactly, the way that I do it and some of the tricks and tips that I've learned basically by failure, right? You always learn more through failing than through success, unfortunately. But I've had some very forgiving dogs in the past that have taught me, the best way to get to the end result, what we need. The first thing that you've got to understand with anything involving dog training, especially young dogs, is patience. If you find yourself becoming impatient, just back off and come back to it at a different time. But yeah, you've got to set yourself up for success physically, right? You've got to create a scenario and a situation and a place to train that's conducive to exactly what you're about to train this dog to do. And for me, it's been building a force fetch table or a train retrieve table. And you can go online and see what those look like, but essentially you want to bring the dog up into your workspace, right? You want to be able to, when that dog's sitting down, his head and his mouth to be, chest level with you so that you can manipulate everything that you've got to do with that dog easily. And you're not bending over, you're not reaching up. It's comfortable for you, right? The more comfortable you are, the more comfortable he is, the better this scenario is going to go. So having a table that meets those demands is really a good thing for you and the dog. Um, Once you've got that situation, you've got that table, I like to locate that table indoors if at all possible. I want there to be as few distractions for that young dog as possible. So I put it inside and I shut all the lights off in that room and I only have a light set on top of what we call a Skinner box method, where it's just a very sterile environment. The only thing in that environment is you and the dog and what it is you want him to focus on, right? So don't have it outside. Don't have it near other dog pens. Don't have it, near bird pens and near areas where he can be easily distracted. And shut everything off in that room except for the area that you're working, so that he can't even be distracted by objects in the room. Once you've got that situated, right, and that could take a little bit of time. It could take some money. It could take some expense. Um, but if you can get to that point, you're setting yourself up for success. And the first thing that I do with that dog is I place him on that table daily, multiple times a day. He eats every meal from that table. A lot of times he'll eat food from my hand because we're going to start incorporating my hands and his mouth and making him understand that's a good thing, right? And we'll talk about that a little more. But getting that dog on that table, handling him on the table, petting him, talking to him soothingly, making him know that that table is a great place to be, a fun place to be, feeding him on the table so that he, associates that table with food with as many positive things as you can possibly make it, right? Nothing negative. Force fetch has got a negative connotation and a train retrieve just because people think you're forcing it into the dog. But this is just another way, another session, another training event for you and the dog to complete together. But I mean that in all senses. You're completing it together, right? Your dog can't get to where he needs to be without you. You can't get to where you need him to be without obviously working in conjunction with one another. So first thing I do is I just desensitize him to that table. Make sure he can walk up and down it. Um, you're going to have to guide him. I mean, last thing you want to do is have him fall off. But make sure that everything on that table is done positively. Positive introduction to the table is key. If it takes a week, if it takes 2 weeks to wag his tail every time he gets on that table, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for him to enjoy being on that table with me handling him, with me putting my hands all over him. And then we'll start desensitizing his face and his mouth, right? So that's kind of phase one. You want him to get on that table, enjoy the table, not be afraid of the table and associate it with good things. When you see that dog get on that table and start to get excited, you know that you can kind of move on to the next phase. But don't rush that first phase. It's extremely important that that dog understands the table is a good thing, right? Too many people jump on that table and just start hammering the dog, and he associates that table with nothing but negative things, right? But we want it to be extremely positive. It should just be called, the positive trained retrieve. That's what you want to think about in the back of your mind. Make everything good for the dog, make it a good outcome, and teach him that he can win, teach him that he can make this as enjoyable as he wants it to be, right? So once we desensitize him to the table and make sure that he understands the table is a great place, what I like to do is I have a chain that hangs from the cable that goes up and down the table. And on one side of the table, I wrap that chain around, the upright post, or I make it to where he cannot go up and down the table anymore. He's no longer free to move about. He's going to stay stationary in one position. And I use a chain because, you'll be training dogs of various heights. You want to be able to make sure that when he's on this chain, he can't drop his head on the table, right? He's got to keep his head up. He's got to keep it as still as possible. And that's going to set you up for success as well, because the second that he starts feeling any type of pressure, most dogs want to move away from it, right? And if he's allowed to get away and move away and run away from it, you're going to have to back up in your training program and fix that. So make sure that he can't get away, right? That's done just with having a flat collar on the dog and a buckle on the chain and attaching him to the chain. You want him, when he's sitting down, for that chain to be taut on his neck to where he can't really drop his head at all. When we're teaching a dog to retrieve, when I'm teaching a dog to retrieve, I really like the head being up high the entire time. I want him to reach up at all times to give me the object, right? Because we're working together. A dog that gets used to putting his head down will be more apt to spitting an object on the ground as opposed to retrieving it to hand, is what I've found in the past. So I like to keep his head up. Another thing that does is it increases the dog's confidence, right? There's no dog that's not sure of himself or confident or having a good time whose head, is down and his tail between the legs, right? So we want to keep his spirits up. And a lot of that's done with posturing. So keeping his head up, keeping his head high, keeping him confident in what he's doing. And that's all very important for a young dog. So pumping him up, once you get him tethered to that side of the table, that's when we're going to really start. When his head can't move away from you, that's when we're going to start introducing things into his mouth. That's kind of the next phase that we move into. And this is a really important phase as well. Introduction into his mouth, things being put into his mouth essentially without his consent. He's not picking them up. You're putting them in his mouth for him, right? So that's another really big step. And there are multiple phases of this, and get the question all the time, well, how long does it take?
I was going to ask that.
Yeah, every dog's different, right? But I can assure you that if you're doing these things in the way that I'm asking, telling you to do them now, making sure everything's positive, making sure your dog's staying confident, having a good time, it takes significantly less time than if you make mistakes. Teach the dog this is a negative thing. He's got to do it. He can run away from it if he needs to. He can get away from it. Those are all going to add time to this process. But I've force fetched or I've trained retrieve dogs in as little as 2 weeks. It's taken as much as 2 months, right? And I really just go off of the dog. Every dog's different, just like every person's different. They pick things up a little differently. But you've got to pay attention to what that individual dog is telling you and kind of work with him and figure out what works for him. And that's kind of the challenge that every trainer that I know enjoys, right? If every dog was the same, it'd be pretty boring for us. So every dog creates a new challenge and presents a new challenge. And it's up to you as a trainer to be able to help him overcome those obstacles, right? Once we get him to that side, again, and he can't move away, what I like to do is use my hand. My hand is the first thing that goes in the dog's mouth. As a puppy, it's probably been in his mouth before, multiple times, playing tug, him wanting to chew on you, teeth on you. It's nothing new to him. But it also allows me as the trainer to feel the dog's mouth, right? I need to be able to feel when he's tense and when he's calm. That's very important. Tense and calm. I utilize the middle fingers of my right hand and I grasp the dog's collar with my left hand. So I'm holding the dog's head still. I'm not forcing him, I don't have a death grip on it, but I'm making him understand that his head's going to have to stay here, right? And the chain's kind of doing that as well. And then I'll take my right hand and these two middle fingers will go in his mouth, just behind his canines. With the other hand, I'll lift his lips up so he's not pinching his top lips, right? A lot of times when dogs close their mouth and there's something in it, they can pinch their lips, and that's not a pleasant feeling for any dog. So make sure their lips on the top of the jaw and the bottom of the jaw are out of the way. And these two middle fingers go right behind his canines. And it's nice because you can use your thumb on the lower jaw to control his mouth, right? He's going to buck. He's going to throw a fit. He's going to try to move his head. He's going to be tense, right? Your finger's going to be over his tongue. He's going to try and spit your fingers out with his tongue. And you're just going to remain calm and talk to him soothingly until he relaxes. And the second that he relaxes, and you can feel the tension leave his mouth, the second he stops moving and relaxes, it goes away. You remove your hand from his mouth, right? Timing is important with this as e-collar conditioning and e-collar training because it's exactly the same concept, pressure and release, right? Your fingers in his mouth are creating pressure. In order for him to release that himself, he's got to calm down and release tension, right? So the second he calms down and releases tension, it goes away. You remove it, and essentially he's removing it, but through repetitions, he's going to understand that he's removing it, you're not removing it. That's the message that you're relaying to the dog is he controls, how long this object stays in his mouth. And the second that he, relaxes and tension goes away, the object goes away. That's extremely important in the first stages. And we do that for, 3 or 4 days, multiple times a day, 4 or 5 minute intervals until you get a dog who's accepting your fingers in his mouth. And then once he's accepting it through successive approximation or baby steps, we just leave those fingers in there longer and longer. And we're soothingly talking to the dog and petting him. And you'll start to see his tail wag, right? You'll start to see him realize that this is a good thing. When these fingers are in my mouth, I get petted, as long as tension goes away, that's not a bad thing. We're just teaching him that it's okay to have something in your mouth. And the sooner that you accept it, the better off it'll be. The longer it's in there, the more you get loved on. And then I choose, to remove it as soon as all tension is gone, right? So that's just so important. Teaching the dog that he controls how long that object's in his mouth. And that really carries over. Just like e-collar conditioning, if you do that step properly in the beginning, it's going to lay the foundation for the rest of the trained retrieve because you're teaching him, again, he controls how long it's in his mouth. He controls whether or not he feels pressure by accepting it or, when he relaxes, obviously. That's super important because we want him relaxed. When he's relaxed, he's in a state of mind that allows him to receive information. When he's tense, all he's focused on is, getting that out of his mouth. He's not even learning what you're anticipating or trying to get him to learn, right? So that's the big first step, deconditioning to the table, making sure that he's okay with your fingers in his mouth. And I use my fingers with no glove. I see guys put gloves on. It's harder for you to feel the dog's tension release with gloves on, right? Are teeth sharp? Sure. But if you have a dog that's biting your hand when it's in his mouth, we probably need to back up a few steps and correct that issue. And that's not something that needs to be fixed on a force fetch table. That's just a dog that probably doesn't have a whole lot of respect for the owner to begin with. So that's something else entirely. But most dogs, especially young dogs, will accept your fingers. And I, again, don't use a glove because I want to feel that tension or the relaxation. It's super important. And once you get there, again, that's, in my opinion, that's the first step to the trained retrieve. And that's the foundation for it all, too. But that's so important that you get that step right in the very beginning.
And so, obviously, every dog's different. And that is there any kind of breed correlation between the softer breeds versus? I mean, is that a true theory, or individual dogs? In other words, is there a setter that may take longer, but there's a setter that also is going to accept it, sooner, as opposed to a different breed that maybe accepts pressure easier? You've always heard those theories out there. So
Yeah.
what's your feeling on that?
Well, I mean, I'll go back to the obedience training that I do and I continue to do with dogs of various breeds, right, for pet obedience. I've got a Cane Corso at the house right now who, I mean, genetically, that's a dog who should feel zero pain. They were made to be guard dogs and attack dogs, and he feels pressure at a much lighter level than a doodle that I've also got back there, a golden doodle, right, which should be a much softer dog in people's opinions. But, I think that dogs genetically are supposed to be built to withstand some physical, I would say, different variations in weather, things like that, right? A Chesapeake Bay Retriever should probably be able to swim in colder water than an English Pointer, right? But when it comes to pressure, and e-collar pressure especially, because that's what this is going to morph into. This is going to all turn into e-collar pressure, and you communicating with him for the train retrieve through e-collar pressure. I think every single dog is an individual dog at that point. I think that when you start this process, if you muddy up the very beginning foundation, that's where different dogs and different breeds probably have a bad rap. I think every dog's different. Every individual dog within that breed, and every individual breed obviously is different. But it's my belief that every single dog's different, just like every person's different. And some people mistake hard-headedness or stubbornness for misunderstanding. Right? A dog that I've seen that people have written off as being hard-headed or
Right.
bullheaded is just a dog who wasn't as intelligent as some of the other dogs that I'd worked with, right? So you just needed to approach things in a different way with that dog and spend a little more time with him and a lot more patience with him. Most of the time when people say this dog's bullheaded, he just needs something a little different that the trainer probably couldn't figure out and kind of writes off as being a stubborn dog, right? But not always the case, in my opinion.
So that gets into the how dogs learn kind of side of it. Then that particular
Yeah,
dog
yeah, yeah,
may not learn, may need a different technique or more time to learn the same thing that that other dog did.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so that's kind of thing you thrive on, I think.
Oh, for sure. And I don't put a time limit on anything. If
Yeah.
a dog takes 3 weeks with just my fingers in his mouth, that's what we're going to do. That's what we'll do. That foundation is so important to solidify. You can't really with steps in the trained retrieve, you cannot move from to step 3 without completing step 2 entirely. The same with step 1, right? So you've got to complete these steps in their entirety before moving on to the next step. If you don't, um, it's going to take much longer, and you're not going to get as good of a product in the end, right? So the next step after he's accepting my hand in his mouth is going to be the introduction to different things in his mouth, right? Different objects, and it's also going to be the introduction to pressure. And I use, there's a couple different ways that you can produce pressure when it comes to the trained retrieve. Some people use a toe hitch method that squeezes the toes together, and when it does so, the dog reaches down to try and bite what's hurting his toes, and then you slip an object in his open mouth. Um, I don't utilize, that method. That method's got a lot of moving parts. Again, I want this dog in my workspace as the least amount of movement I can do, the better, because timing is everything, right? So the very first thing that goes in the dog's mouth for me after my fingers is this small PVC pipe. Okay. It's easy for me to handle. It's very easy for the dog to slip into his mouth. He doesn't have to open his mouth wide. This is not a very intrusive object. It's smooth. Okay. So this is the first object that goes in the dog's mouth after my fingers, right? And what that looks like is the dog sitting at the end of the table, just like he's been doing every time I put my hand. The same exact the same exact steps are followed, except instead of my fingers, I'm going to slip this little rod, this little PVC pipe into his mouth. I'm going to flip the dog's ear over, and I have his collar up high on his neck. I flip his ear over. The back side of his ear is resting on the buckle of the collar. Keep my fingers through the collar, so keep his head stationary, keep him from moving away. And then with that ear flipped over on the buckle of his collar, I can apply pressure with my thumb, just squeezing his ear on the buckle of the collar. The second that I squeeze his ear, he's going to open his mouth. Most dogs open their mouth to whine or yelp a little, and we're not introducing a ton of pain here. This is just a little bit of an ear pinch, right? Don't go overboard. Don't scare the dog. Again, baby step it in. Use as little as possible, as much as necessary. Okay, that's the saying that I like to stick to with this: as little as possible, but as much as necessary. So again, there's going to be an ear pinch, and then what I like to do is key the dog in on what we're doing. I'll press this on his front lips, and what that does is pinches the lip against the gum, right? And he's going to open his mouth to release that pressure. When he does, pop, this goes in. I pull his lips from the top jaw down, up, get it out of the way. Bottom jaw, same thing. And then once this is in his mouth, I can take my hand and hold his muzzle closed, right? And we're not squeezing down. We're just holding that in his mouth, and then we start soothing him again, okay? And he understands very quickly. This is the same exact thing as the fingers. We're just desensitizing his mouth to different objects, okay? We use that pressure. That's the introduction to pressure. And this is a very important part as well, right? Up until this point, I've just been forcing my fingers into his mouth. He's not felt any type of pressure. We're introducing pressure to get him to open his mouth. A lot of people think that pressure, a lot of people practice that pressure is to have him. If you're increasing pressure to get him to close his mouth, that dog wants to release pressure. So what's he going to do? Man, he is going to hammer down on whatever's in his mouth, okay? That's why I don't utilize pressure to teach him to close it. I teach him to open his mouth with pressure. So the second that he opens his mouth, boom, it goes in, pressure goes away immediately. That's got to be almost simultaneously for him to understand that feels pressure, open his mouth, accept whatever goes into his mouth. Now we're putting things into his mouth at this stage, but he feels pressure. He knows he wants to shut that off. To comply with that, he opens his mouth and something goes in it, and he learns to be okay with whatever's in his mouth. At any point in time, if he tries to spit it out, pressure reemerges. Okay, so you keep that ear, you keep the collar, you keep a hold of it as long as something's in his mouth. Over time, we're gonna build up the duration of time that object's in his mouth. But if any time he tries to spit it out without a release command, this is where a release command comes in too. I say okay every time that something comes out of his mouth. My release command is okay. You can say drop it. You can say drop. You can say whatever it is you want your release command to be. But nothing comes out of his mouth without me saying that command first, fingers included. So in the very beginning, he's getting conditioned to every time beforehand something comes out of his mouth, you're going to give him that command. Okay, and then it comes out. So okay, and then it comes out. If at any point in time he tries to spit that object out prior to the release command, pressure turns back on his ear and teaches him to close back down on it. The second he closes his mouth, it goes away. Okay, so we're not teaching him to bear down. We're just teaching him he's got to hold this in his mouth until the release command is given to him. Okay, that's a pretty pivotal point in the process as well. That's a whole step in and of itself, and that's something that I spend a lot of time on, or as much time as is needed for that dog to understand. Some dogs accept it extremely well. The reason that I use an object is because it's not very intrusive, right? It's easy for him to accept this in his mouth. It's not huge. It's not bulky. I've had a lot of success with something smooth like this. It also allows me to, again, push it, pinch the front of the lip, get him to open his mouth, and slide it right in. So when you're teaching him to hold stuff, obviously as well, this is a slick object. He's going to have to consciously make an effort to bite down just a little bit to keep this in his mouth. If he doesn't, it's going to slide out, right? So that's why we use slick objects, or I use slick objects in the beginning. I want him to understand what a firm grip is, but I don't want him biting down. And again, in the very beginning, that's why I utilize my fingers. I don't know how much he's biting down on this unless I look at it and I can see teeth marks, right? If I see teeth marks, it's too much. I know exactly how much he's biting down on my fingers. Again, that's why I don't use a leather glove in the beginning. I want to feel everything that's going on in his mouth because he's communicating with me through his bite, through his pressure, through his hold pressure. But that's the next step, is introducing an object into his mouth. And again, I use as small an object and as smooth an object as possible. From there, right, once he understands an ear pinch means open your mouth and accept whatever I'm asking you to accept, and then hold that, right, until I ask for you to release it. When he understands that, I start moving up to different size objects. So I'll get a bigger PVC pipe. Again, smooth, but a little larger. So he's going to have to open his mouth a little bigger. This one's a lot longer, obviously. He's going to have to balance that, and something's going to come into play here in a second that's going to teach him how to balance an object. But I'll introduce these pipes, both of these PVC pipes. One's a little bit wider, obviously, but they're varying lengths for a reason. If the dog grips it here, it's going to hang out of his mouth there. If he grips it on this side, vice. So once I get him understanding that it's not, he's gonna have to grab small things in his mouth. He's gonna have to grab large things. I go very quickly to something that he has to target, right? So one of these. This is something I've used for a long time for the trained retrieve. It's elevated off the ground so that once you put it on the table and you start teaching him to go and pick things up away from you, he can grab it with his mouth. His jaw can close around it because it's not flush on the table. But it's also got two sides. It's just a little wooden dumbbell, pretty light, but it teaches him targeting, right? Teaches him, no, you're not supposed to grab right here, right? Because it'll be hanging out of your mouth. The only acceptable place to grab this is right in the middle. So it teaches the dog to target an object in the middle of the object, and that's pretty important too. We don't want a dog retrieving a bird by his head or by his tail feathers. We want him grabbing the bird, in the middle of the object, the middle of the body, and retrieving it to hand as such. So this is another object that I use in the trained retrieve. But it doesn't happen, I utilize this object. So I go from all of these PVC pipes to this object. And once he's receiving this object in his mouth, the same way, ear pinch, you're going to give him once he understands the ear pinch too, he understands that means open his mouth. I give him the command fetch. So ear pinch, give him the command fetch. He understands open his mouth and receive something. He's going to hold it in his mouth for as long as I deem necessary. And then I give him the release command. Okay. He gives it back to me. We're going to stay there for about a week until that's extremely clean. I don't let the dog move around the table, move from that stationary position, that seated position, until those repetitions are clean and we're getting a duration, of a couple minutes of him holding something in his mouth. I'd like to be able to let his head go, walk away from the table, have his head stay high, continue to hold the object, obviously. But you get he understands that, pressure at that point is physical. You've got to be there to provide pressure. So a smart dog, the second you move away from him, will spit the object out because what's keeping him honest, what's keeping him from spitting it out? That form of pressure is gone now, right? So very quickly, we move from ear pinch to e-collar pressure. But everything is done prior to e-collar pressure with the ear pinch for me. And everything's done stationary in a seated position right there in your workspace with minimal distractions, as minimal distractions as possible, so that you can communicate with the dog effectively. And in turn, he can communicate with you too. Getting rid of distractions for the dog is as important as getting rid of distractions for you too, right? So I don't allow my kids to be running around in there when I'm doing it. I shut all the doors. Again, shut all the lights off other than the light above the train retrieve table or the force fetch table. And that's where we're working and that's what we're doing.
I've had people ask me recently, and I think we discussed this at one time. They have the dog that does everything really well. They hunt well, they quarter, they point, but when it comes to the retrieve, maybe that's not finished, and whatever happened in the process, that never really got addressed. And so now
Mm-hmm.
you've got a dog that's 4 years old, perhaps, or maybe even older. If you were going to go back in time, or at least take that dog, is it possible to continue to, to put that dog, even though its age is 4 or 5 and it's been in the field multiple times, multiple seasons hunting? Can you still take that dog and do the process that you've described?
Yeah, there's no reason why not to, right? So again, people think that this is something that's got to be done as a puppy or done early in the dog's life. It's I wouldn't say trick, but it's a form of obedience, right? We're teaching him to be obedient again. This form of obedience is teaching him to go and pick up a designated object in his mouth and bring it back to you. That's just an obedience exercise, right? Any dog at any point in time in their life can be taught this, right? And especially a dog that it's a lot easier for a dog that hasn't been e-collar conditioned, because in turn you can condition a dog with an e-collar in this process as well. But no, any dog at any age can be taught to retrieve. Um, Again, it's going to take a lot of patience. You're going to have to go through these steps. You may have to take a little longer because the dog, older dogs may have some baggage when it comes to a table, for whatever reason, or to being tethered up with a chain to a post, or to, being one-on-one with a trainer with no other distractions. Some of these older dogs may have baggage or issues that you don't know about, and you're going to have to overcome those issues. It's always easier with a blank slate, but it's never impossible with an older dog. If done properly, if the dog understands exactly what you're asking them to do. Clear and concise guidance is only is only possible if he understands what that guidance is even for. So you've got to teach him the game, and this is just a game, but it's something that he's got to be taught, something he's got to learn. It's something that you need to teach him with a lot of patience and following the steps properly, and not moving on until the steps done, right? But no, I mean, I get that question too, and unfortunately, it's difficult for someone to train their dog, their own personal dog, to do this for a lot of different reasons. I think the biggest reason is, it's pretty frustrating to see your dog fail or your dog not comprehend, or all the things that you're going to put on your dog, all the failures you put on your dog, when it's probably just you as a trainer that's failing, and failing the dog and failing the program as well. So a lot of people will send their dog off to another trainer to do it. Even people, even my friends that understand how to do this process, will ask me to train their dog to do it. And a lot of good comes from that, because for a trainer, it's all business, it's not personal. So he's going to work with the dog just like a client, as opposed to a family member, if that makes sense.
Right.
But kind of takes a personal approach if you're doing this with your own dog. But it can definitely be done. In my opinion, it really is the only way to have a finished retriever. Um, I had a retriever that I had trained to do this, and we started doing these HRC hunt tests. Now, these hunt tests happen over the course of a weekend, and there are a ton of dogs that go through it. But you're retrieving dead ducks, right? Dead ducks to hand, and all of these dogs are retrieving them. They're frozen and defrosted, right? And they are disgusting. My dog had been force fetched, so when he went out there for the first time to put this disgusting bird in his mouth, he picked it up and immediately spit it out. I gave him the sit command. I told him to fetch. He understood exactly what that meant. He picked it up and brought it back to me. Now, if he hadn't been taught what that meant, we would have failed that hunt test hands down. And it brought me back to the force fetch table, or the train retrieve table. And I simulated that bird. I got a bird that was pretty similar to those birds, frozen, defrosted, slobbered on by other dogs. And I let him know that that's acceptable to put in his mouth as well, even if it's not something that is as nice as picking up a pristine bird that's never been, just been shot, was alive seconds ago. This is still something that bird is no WC pipes or the training bumpers or the dumbbells or anything else. I'm asking you to pick it up and bring it to me. That's what you need to do. I've had friends who tried to run their dogs in these hunt tests without force fetching them or training them to retrieve properly, and that situation arises more oftentimes than not. And these are dogs that have zero issue putting anything in their mouth and retrieving it. That's what they're bred to do. And they've retrieved ducks, they've retrieved waterfowl, they've retrieved pheasants, doves, everything. But those ducks are pretty gross. And so it's something that you've got to teach the dog to do. That step that we stopped at, that we just finished talking about, is not the end result. The force fetch table is long, and it's got that cable on it for a reason. We're going to start baby stepping him away. As soon as he's picking up this dumbbell, right, out of my hand, I'm going to start allowing him to reach for the dumbbell. No longer am I going to be bringing this dumbbell to his mouth. Okay. So that's the next step. Up until this point, I've brought everything and put it in his mouth for him. Now I'm going to hold it away from him. I'm going to pinch his ear. I'm going to give him the fetch command. He's going to have to reach out, go to the object. And now he's making the conscious effort to put it in his mouth. No longer am I doing it for him. So we hold it inches away, and then just further and further and further away until he's reaching. And that's when we start loosening the chain up too. Okay. You can loosen the chain up to where he can move his head around. And now we're asking him to turn his head right and retrieve it. Turn his head left and grab it. Up, down. We're moving the object around his body, and he's having to move his head to the object, making a conscious effort to pick it up. We baby step that until we can put it on the table, and we ask him to pick it up off the table. Once he's picking it up off of the table, that's when I start with the collar. So I tie the ear pinch and the collar together, pressure from an e-collar, because there's no way that you're going to have a dog that's 100 yards away from you after a crippled bird that doesn't want to retrieve. You tell him fetch. You can't go out there and pinch his ear and make him do it, right? So pressure from the ear pinch and e-collar pressure are going to be the exact same thing to this dog. It's a little more labor intensive. You've got your hands full at this point with a dumbbell or something to put in the dog's mouth, for him to put in his mouth. You've got your hand on his ear in the collar. You've got an e-collar on, and now you've got a remote in the same hand as the bumper or whatever it is that you're asking the dog to retrieve, right? That's why I like to wait until I can put the object on the table for the dog to pick it up. That frees up my hand to work an e-collar remote. But it's the same exact thing, right? We same exact steps. He feels the ear pinch, he hears fetch, and now he feels collar pressure. The second he goes down and picks it up, at this point, we're waiting for him to put it in his mouth, right? That's how you get a very speedy response. You get a dog that's not lethargic with going to put it in his mouth, because he understands the second that it goes into his mouth, pressure turns off. So again, e-collar pressure, ear pinch at the same exact time until he goes down, boom, they both go away. We'll do that for quite some time until we can phase out the ear pinch completely. And he's responding only to e-collar pressure. So I say the word fetch, e-collar pressure turns on. He knows to shut it off by picking up the object that you put in front of him. And at that point, we can really start having the dog move up and down the table, start moving the object further away from him, always starting in the seated position, in my opinion, getting the dog to focus on the object, understand exactly. Now, again, this is a sterile environment. It's the only thing on that table for him to pick up. He knows exactly what's being expected of him. And clear and concise guidance and instruction is paramount, right? Everything else on the table is gone. There's only one thing that can shut pressure off. It's a thing that he's put in his mouth hundreds of times at this point. So he understands you're asking him to go down the table, pick it up, put it in his mouth. Any dog that can do that is going to understand. I mean, if the dog understands to come at that point, you should probably have taught the dog, a recall command beforehand. But even if you haven't, you can put a check code on him, call him back to you, and pull him to you. Again, if at any point he drops the object or loosens his grip, pressure, 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 repeat the command, fetch. Once he grabs it again or closes his mouth, pressure goes away. So we're teaching the dog, again, he determines, just like e-collar conditioning, just like e-collar training. Fetch command is the same as the sit command, is the same as the come command, is the same as the down command or place command. We're asking the dog to do something that he understands to do. If he chooses not to do it, he's going to feel e-collar pressure until he does do it, right? So I ask you to sit. He doesn't want to sit. E-collar pressure, sit. Once he does sit, e-collar pressure goes away. It's the same exact concept with retrieving. Again, that's why it's just an obedience act, that we're teaching a dog to do. Retrieving is the same as sitting, is the same as place command, especially when it comes to pressure. But that's the most important part, is making him understand that he controls whether or not he feels pressure, and how long he has to endure pressure for, right? If he's on his way back to me and he spits an object out or drops it, boom, e-collar pressure starts immediately. I tell him fetch. He turns around, he goes, picks that object up, pressure goes away, comes back to me. And then we can get, I like to get into, especially because at this point the dog understands what the place command is. I like a dog to bring me a bird, sit next to me, and give it to me. That's just that's kind of my preference as probably in the retriever world, training retrievers. I want that flip finish, sit next to me, hold the object until I'm done, messing around with whatever gun I have or e-collar remote that's in my hand, and I can safely grab the bird from you, right? So that's something that, we're really finishing out a dog at that point. But again, these are the steps that I follow for a trained retrieve, and I've had a lot of success along the way. But there's nothing more important than understanding that you've really got to finish one step before moving on to the next, and take as much time on that one step as the dog needs, right? Don't put a time limit on it. Take as much time as the dog needs.
So when you're talking about the e-collar pressure in that force retrieve process, that takes us back to when we talked about last time we had you on. We talked about e-collar conditioning your dog, and we talked about finding that sweet spot where you started at 0 and you increased the intensity till you found that level where the dog had some reaction,
right?
And not, that's probably the same level you're looking for when you're talking about this, the e-collar pressure with regard to this process as well.
Oh yeah, for sure. Right. So again, yeah, and I probably should have prefaced that with this is a dog who's been e-collar conditioned for the most part, right? He understands how to shut pressure off with an e-collar. That's why when you pair an ear pinch with e-collar pressure, it makes a lot of sense to him. I like to e-collar condition a dog prior to force fetching and training him to how to retrieve because he understands how to shut pressure off. Once you bridge that gap and show him, listen, this is how you shut pressure off, you're off to the races. But yeah, you want to use, again, as little as necessary, as much as needed, right? You don't you want to you're not punishing the dog, you're just communicating with him, right? You want that level of pressure to be annoying to him. You don't want it to be painful for him. You just want it to be an annoyance, and you want him to understand that that's going to stay on you. That's going to remain there. It's going to continue to annoy you until you obey. But he's got to understand how to obey. That's one of the biggest pitfalls of e-collar conditioning or training with an e-collar. The dog's got to understand the answer to the test. And then once you give him the test, he's got the answer. He just has to choose, to put the answer down, right? He's got to choose. He's got to choose that for himself. But again, the trained retrieve or force fetch is nothing more than an obedience exercise. That's all it is. And with an e-collar, I don't even know how it'd be possible without one, right? Because we're working at great distances away from you. And that's why I utilize an e-collar in all of my training, but especially in the trained retrieve or force fetch.
Would there be any concern when you've gone to the e-collar and you have the dog in the field, and for whatever reason he balks at picking up the bird in the field or whatever, and then you're wanting to apply that pressure because that's the only way you've got, the dog's 50 yards away. That's the only
Right.
pressure that you have. Is there any concern about that pressure or somehow that, I've heard people say, well, if you apply that pressure while that dog's trying to pick up a bird, he's going to have problems from there on because he's going to associate that bad feeling that he got or that pressure with that bird.
Yeah.
Do you subscribe to that at all, or is that
Well,
something that's
yeah.
not an issue?
Well, sure. If your timing is off and you're providing pressure, you're giving him e-collar stimulation or pressure when he's going to pick up the bird. Well, he knows how to shut it off. And if he's trying to shut it off by doing what you're asking him to do, feels pressure, he's going to say, well, that's not the right answer. Maybe he wants me to come back to him because e-collar pressure also means come back to me when I ask you to. Maybe I didn't hear the come command. But before we get to that point, we really have got to be solid on retrieving birds in a
Right.
yard, you know, before we take him into a field. And all of this stuff that goes into his mouth, right? We haven't even talked about bumpers or birds or feathers, and that's another step of the program, right? Where he's got to be comfortable with birds in his mouth. That's a huge step. A lot of dogs don't like the way the birds feel in their mouth, but again, the more objects you can put in his mouth in a positive way on the force fetch table, on the train retrieve table, in a place where he understands exactly what's expected of him, we start moving into birds in his mouth then, and he understands if there's a bird to be picked up, I need to pick that bird up, right? That's what the table does for us. There are it leaves room for zero doubt, right? That bird becomes the only thing on the table at that point. I ask you to pick it up, you need to pick it up. And that, transitions into the yard after that at short distances, but then at long distances. And then, shooting birds over the dog. But yeah, if I couldn't see what the dog was doing or was attempting to do, there's no way I would provide e-collar pressure.
Yeah.
Even if there's a chance that I would have timed it correctly, because there's more of a chance that you're going to time it incorrectly. Again, we're not going to move out into a hunting scenario until
That's
that dog
true.
is completely
Yeah, you
solid.
got to do a lot of things on the ground before you ever
Oh
get to
yeah,
that point.
yeah. And one of those things that I like to do is not even tell the dog to retrieve, but have a down bird, in the yard or in a field, and walk that dog downwind of it. His nose needs to kick on. He needs to go and investigate. If that bird is in fact down and dead, he needs to bring it to me. He needs to start looking for opportunities to bring me birds, right? That's when you know that you're ready. He's going to be the dog that can go out into the field and retrieve the bird for you. Again, force fetch has got such a negative connotation because it makes people think that if the dog doesn't want to retrieve, you're going to make him retrieve. Now, in my opinion, the trained retriever force fetch clears up any question in the dog's mind as to what's expected of him. And once that is cleared up, right? Once a dog knows and understands and comprehends fully what's expected, there won't be an issue, right? And the e-collar is just a communicatory device, right? If he's confused as to whether or not you want to pick that bird up or another bird, or if he spits it out for any reason, we just need to be able to communicate with him that you're going to go back and you're going to get that bird and bring it back to me, because that's what I'm asking you to do right now. I think we lose sight of all of the things that go through a dog's head when in the field. One very common mistake, right, that you see dogs make in the field is when they're retrieving or when they're going to retrieve. Um, they may flare off of the bird, or they may drop the bird and go do something else. A lot of times they're going to go and hunt with another dog. If they see another dog move into a productive area, or they see another dog on point, these dogs are much more apt to point and enjoy pointing than they are retrieving, right? These pointers and setters. So they may want to be a part of that. Now, I've seen dogs hold the bird in their mouth and point at the same time, or back another dog. That dog understands exactly what's expected of them. Bring that bird to me and don't drop it until it's in my hand. But we're not forcing the dog to do anything. This dog fully understands what's expected of him at this point, and we're able to communicate exactly what we'd like for him to do, and hold him accountable when he chooses not to. That's how I look at the trained retrieve. Um, and following all those steps is kind of how to get there. Um, it's sometimes it's difficult for people who can't see the steps that I'm describing. Um, and it may be something. I've got a young dog that I've got to conduct this training with. So I may put a string of videos together for people that need that or would like that. Make it available to them, because talking about it is one thing, and it's easy for me to envision it because I've done it so many times. But for someone who's new to it, it might be hard to understand exactly what I'm talking about, or envision what I've done, or what I'm just. So some videos would probably be helpful, but there are a ton of videos online that you can go and find and look at. Just just remember and just run them in conjunction, kind of with what I've been talking about. Those steps are vitally important, and not moving on to step two before step one is complete is just as important as understanding the
Well,
steps.
we all get guilty of wanting to get that young dog to the field as soon as we can, because we all want to shoot birds over dogs, and
Oh yeah,
shooting it over your new dog or your
yeah,
first season dog is always something everybody is looks forward to doing. But in some cases, some people just rush that situation,
hmm
and it's better just to take your time. And if you need another summer between seasons to make sure that dog is reliable and understands what's expected, then maybe that's what it's going to take.
yeah,
But I mean, I've seen some young dogs that shouldn't have been in a field in the situation they were in. They just
hmm
weren't ready for that. But yeah, it's great. And I think the big problem, and from your background, of course, is just that, because you have to do it, and you had to do it for a living and still do. But you had to be able to. How's that dog thinking? What does and I think that's what people sometimes, all of us sometimes lose that that fact that the dog isn't learning like we learn. I mean,
yeah,
like you and I learn, that dog is does it in a little different manner. And so getting in the dog's head and understanding how to make that dog know what we want is the key. And every dog is a little different, but from what I've learned from you, is that's the key. If you can kind of dig into the behaviors of the dog and know their personalities, and what works with this dog might not work with this guy, but you make the adjustment as the person that's doing the training. And if it takes 5 more weeks, it takes 5 more weeks for.
yeah,
But I
yeah.
think what happens is everybody, especially in the industry where they're training, where they're force breaking dogs, and they're on a time schedule where I told somebody I'd have their dog done in a certain number of weeks,
hmm
and but that's how I get paid when their dog's done.
Yeah,
Sometimes that is where I think dogs get pushed maybe more than they should, and sometimes that's not when they come out the other end. Maybe they're not as reliable as they would have been if somebody like you would have said it's going to take another month and a half with this guy before he's ready. But
yeah,
and I think that's the main thing to remember, is you got to be patient. It's frustrating, all of them are. I mean, the ones I've done, it's just the baby steps and every day. And you think, and you've been doing this for a week and a half and this dog
Mhm.
just has not gotten it. And then suddenly one day, boom, it happens. And you're thinking, by gosh, I'm getting through to this dog or he's getting through to me. I don't know. But when the steps all come together and that dog makes that beautiful retrieve in the field after all that training, it really makes it all worthwhile. So,
Yeah.
but we appreciate your expertise in this area. I just wish you lived a little closer to me, and I'd have my dogs over there with you training them. But especially this new girl that we've got. Um, but hey, we'll have you back. You're kind of that contributor that we have had on for different kinds of phases of training, and we've got some other ones I know we've talked about in the mill where we'll have you come back on. And so anybody, our listeners that are out there that are interested in the training stuff, feel free to send us emails. And if you've got questions for Ian, we'll make sure that he gets them and on the website. And like he said, maybe it's time to put together a little video series now that you have a little more time to
Yeah.
do those kind of things and help some people out in that manner. But the thing about it is, I guess, as an individual with your own dog, it's just don't be afraid of it. Learn it, do it, and be consistent. I think that's the main thing I've learned from you is you got to be consistent as a trainer, right?
Oh man, for sure. Yeah. Consistency pays off because like you said, one day it just clicks for the dog. A lot of times it clicked for that dog 3 days prior, but he's just waiting to see if you'll give up. Maybe if I just continue to buck this guy, he'll just give in and give up. But consistency pays off,
I've
and
I've
he
got a
understands.
I've got a little female I think that's doing that to me right now. She's been doing that to me for a while. She kind of
Mhm.
she's that hard-headed dog you mentioned. Maybe it's just because she's not hard-headed. It's just that I haven't been able to find the better way to teach her than some of the others. But we appreciate you coming on. We appreciate
Yeah,
your
for sure.
time, and we look forward to getting you on again in the future. And again, for everybody out there listening, be sure to subscribe to the Setter Tales podcast. That's how we are continue to grow this program, and we'll continue to bring you some excellent guests like Ian and some other people not only in the setter world, but in the upland dog hunting world in general. And we've got some more of those lined up here for future podcasts. And if you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts and some of the platforms, make sure you leave us a review because that helps as well. And, let us know what you'd like to hear about. And if we're doing the right thing here and you like the program, help us out, get on there and subscribe. That's how we'll keep this thing going. So from us here at Setter Tales Podcast, I'm Wade. And as my partner Thomas would say, keep your nose in the wind.